Ooh, yay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to what promises to be quite an exciting conversation. I am super excited for today's conversation because we're going to be talking about Tlokonolo's favorite topic ever, after James.
SEX. My favorite.
Can you feel the excitement? I can feel it all the way from here, and he and I are in different houses. I am so excited. I just want to say hi to everybody who is joining us. Dr. T, and of course, the amazing Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah. I hope that I've said that correctly. I am so sorry if I didn't, Nana.
It's good enough.
I mean, as Alma said, now when we talk about sex, I get so excited. Because I think what's really important, especially when we think about the sex lives of African women, is to think about like what Nana says really in the preface of the book, right? The idea of like sex for African women in particular and for Black women around the world has been something, and I think also for queer people more broadly, has been something that it's been taboo, right? So it's something that people have to think about hush hush. So I think it's really a political act for us to speak openly about sex and speak openly about the ways in which like sex moves around in the world. And what better like day and time to bring two like feminists together, Dr. T's Guide for Sexual Health and Pleasure. So I will just read Dr. T's like mini bio. Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to enjoyment of the highest attainment of physical and mental health, a medical doctor at DISA Clinic in Johannesburg with a focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as a senior lecturer and a broadcaster. And her book is titled A Guide to Sexual Health and Pleasure. And then we also have Nana.
Yes, and I am so excited to introduce Nana Darkoa Sekyiamah, who is a feminist activist, writer, and blogger. She's the co-founder of the Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women award-winning blog that focuses on African women, sex, and sexualities. She works with the Association for Women's Rights in Development as Director of Communications and Media, and is here to talk about her latest work, The Sex Lives of African Women. Welcome, Nana and Dr. T. We're super, super keen.
Thank you. And can I just say, I am so excited to be in this conversation with Dr. T. I'm a huge fan of you, Dr. T, your work, your activism. Absolutely loved your book. So it's such an honor to be here with you and sharing space.
Oh, thank you so much for allowing us to share this with you on your new book, and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I think it goes without saying, like, I mean, Alma normally knows that people we bring onto our podcast is books that we've really loved and themes that we want to explore. But I personally want to say I really, really enjoyed The Sex Life of African Women. Like, whoa!
What did you enjoy the most?
I mean, we'll talk about it, but I think like one thing that was really enjoyable for me is like just like how like I don't want to say graphic, but now how nonchalant these people spoke about sex, right?
Yes.
And spoke about the ways in which sex moves in their lives. And that for me, I haven't found, right? Like I think about when Dr. T released her book, A Guide to Sexual Health and Pleasure, how people were sort of dubbing it as the Kama Sutra of African women, right? And like, oh my gosh, like, do we talk about like sex moves? And a lot of people are like, when you say, oh, you should read Dr. T's book, they're like, oh no, I don't have problems in the bedroom. So it's when I think we're going to talk about the sex lives of African women, your book is sort of going to be positioned in the same way that Dr. T's book, like my sex life is okay. So I don't need to be talking about sex. And I suppose the first question to both of you, actually, Nana, and we'll start with you, is when you were conceptualizing this book, right? What was the intention? Why was it important for you to write about the sex life of African women? And then Dr. T, after Nana, why was it important for you to write a guide to sexual health and pleasure?
Thank you so much for that brilliant question. So like you had mentioned in my introduction, I co-founded a platform called Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women. And on that platform, myself, my co-founder, Malika, and I, and so many contributors, we made the deliberate choice to share our experiences of sex, really, because we felt that this was a political act. If you don't talk about your body, if you don't talk about what brings you pleasure, if you don't talk about who you choose to love, like how can you take up space even in the public domain? And also just as a way to give people access to, in a sense, sex education, because a lot of us don't get sex education growing up. And even when we get it, it's extremely limited. It's definitely not comprehensive. And so from having encouraged women for over a decade now to share their stories about sex, I knew that what was out there is so much more than the media tends to portray, especially when it comes to the sexuality of African women. Especially in Western media, we're portrayed as, victims of FGM, women who are constantly pregnant, women who don't have access to sanitary towels. And yes, that may be true, but that's not the whole truth. And I really just wanted to show the full range of our experiences and to show how interesting and complex and funny and sad and happy our stories are. So it's not just one single story. It's, it's multifaceted. And that's really what's my intention with the book.
And you, Dr. T?
Wow. So, mine comes from a position where I'm a healthcare provider to many people who are very different. And it's through the consultations, spending about a decade before I actually wrote the book, that actually encouraged me to pen it down, because I had realized, firstly, that there are so many taboos and so many myths, but also such harmful stereotypes around sexuality, sexual expression, gender, and again, who's allowed, right, to actually claim their body and enjoy and experience their body. And I found that with the book, I wanted to present what I call the triangle, right? The sexual pleasure, sexual rights, and sexual health, and how they merge and how they are equally important in this triangle into us having the best sex life that we choose to have. And that's why I centered the book around consent. I centered the book around people knowing their own bodies first, and also around the idea, and I call it now self-play and self-discovery, as opposed to masturbation, right? Because even that word alone carries so much. And that's why I wrote the book. I just wanted to give people access to information that's credible, but in a very, I suppose, easily digestible way. And hence I share parts of my story in the book. And I don't think I could have done it any earlier, because I was not ready myself to be vulnerable in that way that the book required, for me to share. But it's really just about how do we assist people to have the best sex life that they choose to have.
I'm really connecting with what you said about, sorry.
No, go for it, Nana, go for it.
I was just saying, I'm really connecting with what you said about the importance of you yourself being vulnerable and sharing yourself and your story through the book. That's also something that I deliberately decided to do. So in the Sex Lives of African Women, the final story is my own story. I don't think you can be out there and tell people to share their stories, and not share your story with them. So
I was struck by the prologue and how you wrote about entering the idea of African women having sex into the collective consciousness, so sexual pleasure, and the idea that we are sexual beings and entering that into the collective consciousness. And yet there was a decision to use pseudonyms for the majority of the story, and that in itself is a political act, but also speaks about the positioning of these women both geographically and in terms of society. And I was hoping that we could speak a little bit about that editorial decision, because I think that also speaks so much about the politicization of African women's sex lives, but also what that means for our collective consciousness as well.
Yes. So for me, for every woman I interviewed, I gave them the choice to decide whether they wanted to use their real name or whether they wanted to be anonymous. And yes, a number of them chose to be anonymous, which is a decision I completely understand. I think it would be naive of us to pretend that there are no consequences when you actually choose to speak up about, sex and sexuality, especially when you present it in its full spectrum, right? In my country, Ghana, we currently have 8 members of parliament who are trying to push through basically a homophobic bill, which literally bans people's sexual orientation and even bans people from advocating for LGBTQI rights. In this kind of context, how do you say to somebody, oh, tell me your story and publish it with your real name? You really, really can't, But for me, what was really important was the stories and that they're true stories. And also protecting people's safety is really important to me. And so that's why I give people that option. And of course, I myself, I know that due to my own sort of privilege in terms of class, even the fact that I'm employed by a feminist organization, it allows me to do these kind of things with little consequence. Yeah.
I'm also really interested, and I think both of you can answer this question. I'm really interested in this idea of the role of shame, right? Because I think the books, in many instances, is writing against shame or unshackling ourselves around shame. Because I think when we speak about sex, or when we speak about many of the stories that are in the book, are also about people choosing to not have babies or have babies, and how abortion in many instances is like sort of shamed, right? And it seems as a whole unshackling. And I think, Dr. T, your work as a human rights activist, particularly in this space, is to advocate for safe abortions, but the reproductive health to say this is your body and you can decide what you want to do with your body. So I'm interested for both of you about, like, you know, this idea of unshackling shame and why it's important for African women to unshackle shame, whether it be about like not wanting a pregnancy anymore or not wanting children, and just interest in that particular role.
So I think it's important to also talk about the definition of womanhood, right? And what then that comes with, and Black womanhood particularly. And our bodies have always been something for people to take. And even when we are girls, how we are disciplined and the content of what people say to us about our bodies, it's already driving us to feel shameful, right? So, and this is why it's important to even make distinctions between sexual pleasure being a human right and requiring consent versus sexual assault and abuse and harassment and rape. Because a lot of the times, I think we are raised to muddy that water, right? And muddy the lines between consent so that the rape culture can thrive. And that's why, you know, we live in a country in South Africa with some of the highest gender-based violence and rape cases in the world that go unprosecuted, where survivors go unsupported, because it's normalized that if we take ownership of our bodies and our lives and our sexual lives, we are women who should be shamed. And it carries itself throughout all of our lives. You know, I've had patients in their mid-40s who are wanting to have children, and they basically have not had penetrative sex all their life because of the trauma and the baggage, right? And that people use culture, they use religion, they use all sorts of things to shame us and to keep us in line. And I think so the unshackling very much for me is about get out of line. You don't owe anyone, you know, this perfect Black womanhood, which often serves other people. It's not even for us, it serves other people. And of course, sexual pleasure, for me, it's one of the powerful ways that women can take back their power, even if you are still experiencing and experimenting with yourself in your own private space, and you are not ready, like some of us, to talk openly about it, but it's still valid because it's for you, and that's enough. And I think often that's what, for me, it symbolizes, just having pleasure for the sake of it and for yourself. Because often we are told that sex is something that's done to us. If you get married, you mustn't sleep with leggings on because you have a husband. If your husband comes home, the dishes and the dishes and the, you know, supper must be ready. So there's this you are just a servant in every aspect of your life. And so that's why I think it's important, this idea that we need to validate all of the ways that Black women want to express who they are, and then they should do so freely without judgment and punishment. And again, punitive laws, right, that often will criminalize aspects around women and womanhood and our bodies and pleasure. And of course, not forgetting feminine presenting people as well. And that's why the focus on sexual rights is so important, because how do you express who you are? How do you express your desire if you are criminalized just for being who you are?
Yeah, and I mean, the heartbreaking thing, which you already mentioned, Dr. T, about the shame, is how it starts when, you know, children are so young, when girls are so young, when even just the way people rebuke girls for touching their bodies, you know. And what you were also mentioning about abortion, you know, you realize that in my book, there are two stories, particularly of women who had undergone abortions. And one story took place in Ghana, which ironically on paper actually has one of the most progressive laws around abortion. In reality, there is so much stigma around abortion. And that results in lots of people seeking backstreet abortions, and even because I've interviewed the doctors about this in the past, even doctors who carry out abortions are shamed. I had a doctor tell me, as a doctor or nurse, when you carry out abortion, if like, say you have your own house, people would be like, oh, that doctor, he built his house with abortion money. It's really crazy. So the shame is coming from like childhood, it's coming from society, it's coming from people choosing to control their bodies and their reproductive function. And it's definitely something that I think speaking up about is important as a way to hopefully try and dispel some of the myths and stigma that exists.
I think what this book does so well, and that resonates so much with the Tlaleng and I, is that it also gave a voice to voices, or gave space to voices that we ordinarily wouldn't hear. And some of my favorite stories were the older people in the book writing about their sexuality, because in many ways, that in itself feels political. So you think about the ways in which people think about Black women and feminine presenting people is that you almost lose your sexuality as you grow older. So people can't even conceptualize that you can be in your 60s and still enjoy sex and still enjoy sexual pleasure. And there are narratives in this book that write against that. And I wanted us to talk a little bit about why including those stories was so important for the wholeness of this book.
Yes, those are actually some of my personal favorite stories as well. And the book is divided into 3 broad sections for people who may not have read the book already: self-discovery, freedom, and healing. And the people I placed in freedom were, in a sense, those that I thought of as models for all of us on how to live your best sex lives. And it's not surprising to me that the 2 oldest women I interviewed happen to be in that section, right? And I feel like those are also people who tend to live outside of societal norms. Say that again.
And queer as hell. Like I just
about to say.
I was just like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, of course, right? Like, because like straightness would not. It's not possible.
Absolutely. They were queer. They were usually poly, There were people who were just living outside and living on, I guess, what we'll call the margins. But those were the most free people. Those are the people who had the best sex lives. Those are the happiest people. I didn't set out to find that. That's what happened in terms of everybody that I interviewed, And so for me personally, it was really inspirational that these older women were just like showing that the myths that exist about older women and sex really is just that. It's a myth. They felt more comfortable with their bodies. They were able to negotiate the pleasure. They did not have a lot of hang-ups because they had sort of grown past that. And that was really just inspirational, because I think society just makes us think that sex belongs to the young people, that older people, you're dried up, you should be a grandmother looking after your grandchildren. I'm sure you can do all of that if you want to and still have a great sex life. And and for me, I'm like, yes, okay, these are the women that I am going to look up to,
It's amazing because I often advocate in many spaces for healthcare systems, right, that cater to the sexual health needs of older women, and particularly people with uteruses and ovaries, because we know of the reproductive cancers that then present themselves later on in life. And if we don't pay attention to the fact that even older people have sexual rights and they have rights to sexual freedom and liberation and pleasure, we then will deny the fact that there are literal health issues that impact people's ability to have pleasurable experiences. And that's why even in my book, I particularly have a chapter on sex and menopause, right? Because a lot of women go through a lot of fluctuations in their cycle, in their hormonal orchestra, what I call it. And often they feel very alone because even their own doctors judge them for being older women who want to enjoy sex. And if you add this whole widowhood and how that affects Black women, and we're supposed to perform this whole mourning of a partner, usually a straight man, And that usually signifies as, loss of income, loss of inheritance, loss of land, even loss of your identity for some people. And how that it's so important to always maintain, as a medical doctor especially, and create a safer space where older women can actually seek assistance early and get screening early, because we know some of these health issues have a direct impact on sexual pleasure. And many women, for example, who have cervical cancer on the African continent are thrown out of their villages, out of their communities, right, because of the physical symptoms that some of them have. And so I think it's just great that we have people who are queer in that, freedom chapter, really just sharing with them. And I think, like you saying, it's an aspiration, and we need more of those stories covered. And thanks for bringing those through.
I mean, Dr. You just mentioned it. For me, like, I think what is really like the point, right? The cherry on top of this amazing cake is the queerness and the transness of it all, right? So you think particularly about the freedom chapter, but also the self-discovery chapters and the healing chapter. That this book, right, when we think about like liberation and freedom about sex, like queer people and trans people are at the forefront of this liberation, right? I was particularly struck by, I think about Kuchenga, who said something really profound to be like, I'm attracted to cis men, and I think it's a curse, right? Like, just like the idea of like, there is this limitation that I have, and I need to unshackle myself of this limitation.
Lead us.
and I wanted to speak about why it was important for you to include transness and queerness, right, in a narrative about African women, because we know the sort of prevailing norms about homosexuality is un-African, transness is not natural, and all these particular things. Why was it important for you to bring their stories and your stories to the forefront and be like, we are these African women?
Yes, for me, I mean, how can you write a book about sex and sexuality about African women if you're not going to show the full spectrum of African womanhood? It was as simple as that. Like, it wouldn't be a book about the sex lives of African women if it only centered cis women, And for me, that's just like ridiculous and not something I can do after having blogged about sex for like over a decade now. And so it was just important for me to show reality, and for me, this is also part of our reality, and really important for us to recognize. I think it's rubbish that homosexuality is an African, but we need to keep reminding people, unfortunately, that this is rubbish. Yeah.
And I think that's important, and I want to bring you both into the conversation. I think it's important because you mentioned earlier about this anti-gay law, that's happening in Ghana, but also the context in which you write in is like, in as much as South Africa is also like this progressive place, there is still like some form of limitation for trans people and queer people to exist, particularly in accessing healthcare in the sexual and reproductive space, right? So I want to talk about a little bit about that, right? It's like, yes, we're talking about like how euphoric and amazing this is, but right, these people are living in contexts that don't necessarily accept their identities.
It's an important one, and that's why, even in the UN spaces, in feminist circles, in academia, it's so important to affirm sexual rights. Like, I can't say that enough, because if it's not affirmed as its own right, it doesn't find expression in legislation, or where it does, like in the case of Ghana and many other African countries, there's regression in terms of what was there, right? And if it's not in legislation, it's not in policy, it's not going to be budgeted for. So there will be no resources to then support these very rights. And they have to come alive in accessible services. There's no point just having rights on paper. They literally have to come alive. And so the backbone, I think, of community health, of public health, should be on affirming human rights. And the practice of medicine in itself should be a defense of human rights. And I think, and I've said this in many instances, that I have absolutely no empathy and no time for medics, for example, who get to pick and choose which patients they see and which they service because of their culture and religion, right? People come to you because of particular expertise. And it's how do you then use that expertise in service of others? And we live in a continent that the service of others has to be about promotion and protection of their rights. And just a few weeks ago, with other special rapporteurs from the UN, we actually issued a joint statement on the what's happening in Ghana right now. And I think, of course, it's important, right, that we continue to hold each other and create the space to be able to do this kind of session even today. It's very, very important, I think. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to get emotional, but like when you grow up not having these types of even a dream. I never dreamed that I would write a book that's a bestseller and I'd be sitting here with Nana and Alma and Little Konono talking about sex, like in 2021. Like that was never even in my realm of dreams, and yet this is what's happening now. And it's because we were affirmed. It's because we had access to services. We knew what we needed to do to get where we are now, and we had support in terms of structures that supported us to get here. Of course, we had our own struggles and things that we had to go through. So our privileges are definitely earned. But I think we're doing a lot of important work in just speaking out, because so many people are silenced and shamed. And it's in that silence where the shame, gets internalized. And so I think this is one of those important moments beyond just literary moments. It's really, I don't want to get emotional, but let's stop.
And I just want to say a huge thank you to you and the other special rapporteurs for that statement. It really means a lot. We're really hoping, these statements of solidarity, the various people, lobbying our governments, we're really hoping it makes a difference because this affects people's lives, just on a very, very real basis. But I also very much agree about the importance of telling these like comprehensive stories because I think it makes a difference to people. I have to say, I have been just bowled over by the reaction of people to my book. And people just saying, thank you, I'm going to pass this book on to my daughter. Lots of people just keep saying that to me, I'm going to pass this book on to my daughter. And so for me, the thought of younger generations growing up with a broader conception of sexuality, with a better understanding of sex and a better understanding of sexual rights, I think that's huge.
I think that on that note, there's the section of the book that speaks about healing, and a lot of the people who write in that section have experienced sexual trauma. And this trauma also then exists in the context of them also then wanting to have sexual pleasure post that. And I am interested in really for both of you what it means for those people to have sexual pleasure in that kind of context, right? And I think it's particularly important to have that conversation because so much of the dialogue around survivors is almost as though you cannot experience sexual pleasure having experienced a trauma of that nature, or that it's almost unfathomable for you to even think of wanting to have sexual pleasure. And often people experience that tussle of feelings, right? Between wanting pleasure, but also in the context of knowing what happens to African women and feminine presenting people as it relates to the sexual traumas that so many of us experience. And so I was hoping that we could just speak a little bit about, for you, Nana, why it was important to include those stories in a section around healing, but also for you, Dr. T, because this is a topic that you have written about.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that was really heartbreaking to me is, when I started interviewing women, there was a question I used to ask, and I realized, oh my God, every time I was asking this question, I was more or less triggering a lot of people, right? And that question was, tell me about your earliest sexual memory. And for a lot of people, that's just bound up with experiences of being abused as children. And it was like a bit like, whoa, I hadn't expected there to be so many experiences of, child sexual abuse, particularly. But again, that's like another reality that we have to deal with. But like, obviously, that's not the only part of the story. Part of what for me was also beautiful is the different processes that people go through to heal, and different things work for different people, right? Some people would, go on retreats. Some people would, go on some sort of spiritual cleansing. Some people would choose to be celibate to discover their own bodies. Some people chose to become activists so that they would speak up about the experience that they have had and, sort of contribute to creating a better world for women and girls. And so, I feel like I don't want people to feel like women, girls, feminine presenting people who've experienced trauma are victims. They're very much still people with agency, people who still make a lot of, have a lot of choices, and, simultaneously, often people who still have good sex lives, and are still navigating that. My own story that I shared was really about experiences that I think I still need to heal from, right? And the fact that somebody needs to experience some healing, it doesn't mean they're on a journey. It doesn't even mean that they're not experiencing like sexual freedom or liberation, whatever that means to them individually. And for me, this is just part of the story. And for me, it was important to recognize that both can exist. So, for example, there was a woman who I interviewed who was cut as a child. She experienced female genital mutilation. And part of what really stayed with me was she described that as child sexual abuse. And I have to confess, I have never thought of FGM as child sexual abuse, and she was like, that is exactly what it is. And of course, it was like, ding dong, why haven't I thought about this before? And she also described to me really amazing, powerful sexual experiences that she has, because she's had therapy to deal with the child sexual abuse that she had. And so I think it's important for people to know that even if you've experienced child sexual abuse, you can still, if you choose to, if that's what you desire, have a really pleasurable sex life. And what you and probably lots of other people will need is healing, to be able to deal with what you've gone through.
And so many of my own patients who come for sex therapy actually either in the consultation room realize for the first time that they've actually never had consensual sex. Because often I ask people, when does sex start for you? And for most cisgender women, it starts with someone else's erect penis. And there's not much negotiation or even discussion in between the sex. And when I ask them, when does it end? Well, it ends when he has his orgasm. And so not only were they then realizing that they were not full participant in this activity, and some have been married for decades, it's the fact that they are also not seen as equals in this process by their partner. And a lot of women also have had really, really hectic first sexual experiences. And I had a difficulty because I serve on the Global Advisory Board for Sexual Health and Wellbeing. And one of the work we're doing is on first sexual experience. And I was having a difficulty, particularly interviewing people in South Africa, because of the country we live in of such high rates of sexual violence, and not just sexual violence, but also like really gruesome violence. And I knew that even I didn't have the capacity to deal with those stories. And why would I then want to trigger people and then not offer them any psychological support? Because again, mental health is neglected when we talk about these issues. And it's only if someone reads something or they hear something or they listen to a podcast that suddenly they find that courage to accept what has happened to them. Because some people know they experienced rape or sexual violence, but they haven't quite let it sit, and sometimes it takes really like random moments, like sitting with me in a consultation room, to really start to reckon with what has happened. And many people will say, I am now ready to have good sex. How do I go about it? And that whole journey again of self-discovery, and because even your own body changes, right? So what we then expect our bodies to do and what we think was taken from us by that abuse, it's something that else, people need to process. That, you were at this particular age and you were experimenting, and you may have done everything that, young people want to do. But then you then met with this violence and you are not there anymore. So how do we then assist you with where you're at now? And yeah, that's one of the hardest things. It's when people realize, even in long-term relationships, that they've actually never had consensual sex, even in their marriages. And that's really a difficult thing. But I think there's always hope, because we then get the chance, to talk about consent, to talk about the different ways that they can, go to therapy with their partner, individual partner. But again, these are things we still have to navigate and push hard for. They are not as easy as saying, book an appointment with a therapist. It costs a lot of money. And not many people, have a focus in their own practice in terms of sexual pleasure and sexual rights. And so you often refer people and they come back saying, no ways, I'm not going back there again, because then the stigma and shame is then, and secondary victimization again. So it's a whole thing that we need to break down and to really sit and understand and plan for how do we support each other. And if we are being honest, I think most of us experience violence.
And that's the unfortunate thing, right? Like that sometimes we bond over violence, right? Like we bond that like the way in which we often speak about sex is not about the pleasurable in which we've had sex. It's often about like, I remember when I was younger, someone used to do this and someone used to do that. And it's often hard. Yes, someone wanted to, I think you wanted to speak about self-discovery. So
well, not necessarily just self-discovery. I mean, now that we're speaking about this topic, I think something else that was quite profound in the book was sexual pleasure, but not in the ways that we typically conceptualize it. So I think of non-sex sexual pleasure, right? And also how those were in some ways sites for people to find themselves and for self-discovery. And I think of the person who chose celibacy as an act of self-love, and the descriptions of non-sex but sexual pleasure and pleasure in the book. And I'm really curious about that, because I think that in many ways that also then speaks to ideas around sex positivity, but also our reimagining of what pleasure should or shouldn't look like in different contexts, right?
Yeah, and I think for both of you, right, like for Alma and I, we've been really interested in thinking about, like, I really like the celibacy essay, because it's just like, it often for me reminds me of like how I say like reading books gives me like so much pleasure. And there's like a brand of literature called hysterical literature, of people literally orgasming from reading, and how people don't think that as like sex, but also like this non-sex, right? Like this idea of like, this person saying waking up late in the morning or spending time in bed, just luxuriating in rest is a form of pleasure that people don't understand. And so for both of you, like this context of like understanding sexual pleasure outside the confines of penetrative sex, because that's often what we think of sex as, but also as the idea of like, what does sex positivity look like for both of you?
It's so funny because people often describe me as sex positive, but that's not a term that I would use to describe myself. I feel like my work around sex is motivated by the fact that I'm an African feminist. But I understand, it's just because a lot of the time when I write about sex, I focus on the pleasurable aspect of sex. And I guess I do that deliberately because there's so much focus on the negativity. You just mentioned that we often bond over like traumatic experiences. And I think those are valid. But I think it's really important for us to pay attention to pleasure. I think, pleasure is political. As Black women, as African women, we're not encouraged to be like one of the women I interviewed in my book said, decadent. Like she actually deliberately chooses with her partner to have nights where this is dedicated to hedonism and decadence, and I think that's beautiful, to create space to luxuriate in your body, to luxuriate in your partner's body, to practice self-pleasure, to make sure you're eating good food, you're, touching yourself in ways that feel good. Yeah, I think that's super, super important. Yeah. And to take a break from like the everyday world and the capitalist machine, just to like focus on what makes you feel good.
So for me, I think it's about not wearing a bra. Like that has been like so like liberating. And I think also for fat Black women, it's a thing as well, that like another layer of stuff to work through, and the world kind of gets upset with you, right? If you are not stigmatizing yourself and like, oh, I'm fat and I'm Black and I won't wear bikini or I won't wear costume. So like for me, those are like the moments where I'm like, well, if you don't like to see me in my costume, well, that's fine, but I'm in it, so you can do whatever you got to do. But yeah, so those are like important for me. But it's always again being aware of, is this actually safe? And I think I'm still stuck in that moment sometimes. And I like the fact that sex positivity does not actually involve the act of having sex. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that people have, right? They think being sex positive means just having sex all the time, which it isn't. Understanding consent and choosing celibacy, that's sex positive. All of those experiences, it's about being in charge of your own sex life and negotiating. I mean, look, using safer sex tools like condoms, that's self-love. That is sex positive, And so, yeah, I think that's what it's, I mean, sex work is sex positive, There are many people, for example, and I had the privilege of having a private tour of the red light district in Amsterdam, but they even literally have bays that are designed for people who are using mobility aids with spinal injuries, all ways of pleasure and intimacy. And so if someone must outsource it, good for them. I'm glad that they actually have somewhere where they can do that privacy, with the required dignity and all of that. And so, yeah, for me, sex positivity is a completely open box. As long as we understand the definitions of consent, we seek consent, and we are feeling that we can withdraw consent at any time. I think, people must just have fun and understand for themselves the need for safer sex tools and what that looks like for them.
I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned sex work, right? Because some of the salacious bits of the book, right, like which got me thinking, were also about like people choosing sex work. I mean, we think about Kuchenga, who goes into sex work, right, as a form of freedom in essence, right? And we think about also the Kenyan woman who also goes into sex work and says, like, I've been dating and but you know what? He gave me an ultimatum. He said, choose me or your work. And I said, I chose my work, right? And that like freedom that I really was like, yes, queen. Right? And because she says in the essay, she says, my work has always been there for me. My work doesn't. I enjoy my work, right? And I wanted to speak about that, right? About like how the conversation around sex work, right, anywhere in the world, and particularly like people also conflated about like sex trafficking, human trafficking, all that. But more than anything, it's like these women do not have agency. So no woman in her right mind is going to wake up and say, you know what? I am good at giving fellatio and I'm good at sex. And I want to benefit and derive a benefit from this thing monetarily. People will say, no, we need to start creating strategies in order to allow these people to transition outside of sex work, and nobody will willingly choose this. And I'm like, but people have time and time again told us that I'm good at fucking and therefore I want to get paid for it. And so I wanted to know, what are your thoughts about that, right? This idea of like, and I think, Nana, the essence of also your book is this idea of like, can African women have agency? Can they decide that they want to have sex work and do it? Let us not control them.
I mean, additionally, Nana, before you even answer, I think linked to that, there's a section in that story that Tlaleng is speaking about where her son again stands up and speaks about her, and he's speaking about like his mother, and he speaks about how she's a sex worker, and there's something so particularly powerful just contained in that line, and I think it speaks so much to what the Tlaleng is saying around the idea of just like the acceptance of sex work as work, right? Like that this is you just speaking about your mother could be a nurse, and you would have announced it in the same way at church as her son did in that context. And for me, that was also just a statement around the ways in which sex workers work, and how it's not the sex worker who needs to have a shift of mentality, but like what the Tlaleng was speaking to, is the idea that the people around you need to really normalize the idea that you are working in the same way that Dr. T or that the Tlaleng are doing work every day when they wake up and go to work.
Yes, no, I couldn't agree more. And, for folks who may not have read the book yet and maybe looking to read the book, you're both referring to Philista's story. And Philista's an incredible sex worker rights activist who leads a national organization in Kenya. So she's also one of the people who chose to tell her story openly. It's a story she's told many times. And I think for me, part of what was really, really powerful about Philista's story is, she actually named the moment when she chose to become a sex worker. When she became an adult, she was like, and this is the time, that I made the decision to become a sex worker. because at some point in time she was underage, and obviously when you're underage, you can't give consent, right? And so for me, that distinction is really, really important. And Kuchenga as well, who you also earlier referenced, she traveled from London to Berlin because in Berlin she could work legally as a sex worker, and that offers her protection that she can't access in the UK. And I think that's the really key thing. If your workers recognize this work, then you can be protected. Then you are not going to be targeted by the police, because what a lot of sex worker rights activists say is that actually the danger comes from the police. Usually when sex work is made illegal, then they are vulnerable. And usually especially in Ghana, a year ago, we had an Adventures Live festival, because that's something we do from time to time. We had a panel with sex worker rights activists, and they said, they get harassed by the police. The police literally rob them, take their earnings off them, and rape them. And this is because it's illegal. So by criminalizing sex work, you're actually making the people you claim you want to protect more vulnerable.
Yeah. I think the system also punishes women with agency, right? So firstly, they look at you and think, oh, you are liberated. Okay, good for you, but just do it behind closed doors. But now you have a woman who's not only sexually liberated, she knows what she wants. She can negotiate a whole transaction. And I think sex workers can teach us a thing or two about consent, by the way.
Sure.
Exactly, if you look at all the things that they have to negotiate, right? And then you actually enjoy it. How dare you, right? And then you make a profit off of it. And now capitalism says, excuse me, we need to be having profits of that, like they do with everything. And this is the one area of our lives, of our bodies, that we control. And that's why governments and states come down so hard on sex workers. And I find, and I truly believe this, that sex work is a metaphorical middle finger to the system. And as a Black woman, as a feminist, I fully support decriminalization of sex work everywhere, and will not settle for anything less than decriminalization. And I really think that sex workers, if people listened to what they want, it's really not that hard. And it's outside of criminalization that sex workers can then start to actually develop an industry, have their own health and safety standards, have their own occupational standards, have their own labor standards, by the way. But when you are still criminalized as a being, as a person, you can't do that. You can't do that. But I do think that sex work is definitely a middle finger to the patriarchy, to capitalism. And of course, that won't go down well, will it?
I wanted to read a little bit from Kuchenga's story, because I didn't know, the first part of the story was just I loved it. And then I want us to talk a little bit about Fatu, thinking particularly about religion and culture, because Fatu is also really an interesting story to think about. But Kuchenga writes, my attraction to cis men is the bane of my life. It's a curse. They don't care about me. They don't care about my writing, my politics, my thoughts, my intellect, or the fact that I saw a Palestinian film. They don't care about my full humanity. All they see is the jiggling of my tits and my bum. To them, I'm a modern-day hot knot Venus. That's what's going on. That has nothing to do with me. That's not something that I can control. I have no intention of tricking any man into liking me. There's nothing of value in that for me. On the contrary, the more knowledge they have of my trances, the better it's for me. But I think Kuchenga really allows us to think about oppressive systems, and we'll think about another part of self-love and loving yourself out of oppression. But oppressive systems, in the fact that Kuchenga also speaks about the precarity of transness, right? About participating in sex work, which is this liberatory act that I've chosen for myself. There are dangers that come with that, right?
Yes.
So she writes further on in the book, in this, and she says, which, it sat with me for a while, and I was like, yo, man. She writes, with every man I meet, I ask myself, is this man the man that is going to kill me? He could be saying anything under the sun. Sweetness, what is your name? or are you're really a pretty woman? And my mind will go to the headlines of the number of trans girls who've been killed. In my mind, every man I meet is a potential murderer. And so I'm very careful about the ways in which I disclose who I am to them. And for me, that struck me, right? Because it also speaks about the negotiation. In as much as we want to say we're exercising some form of agency and we live in these lives, it's amazing. Our lives are not that straight cut, right? Like particularly when it exists on the fringes as society wants us to exist on the fringes. So like even participating in sex work, which is a liberatory act that we choose for ourselves, we constantly have to think about like our bodies may be a danger to us, right? So who is the next, am I potential, is this man that I'm going to sleep with a potential murderer? And I want to speak to you, both of you, right? I think Kachenga speaks about it in the context of trans particularly, but we think about cis women in this country and we think about the rates of violence in the rest of the world, right? About every time a cis woman or a trans woman or a femme person like negotiates sex with cis as men in particular and cis as straight men, like there is a danger, right? Of like, you're not going to be able to make it. And what are your reflections about that, right?
This one for me, it's particularly hard because I've lost friends who were very close to me who were trans women, who were sex workers, and not only were they experiencing violence at the hands of their clients, but like Nana said earlier, they were also experiencing violence at the hands of the police. They were experiencing violence at the hands of healthcare workers. And we know that even in terms of health outcomes, trans women are still, especially sex worker women, are still experiencing negative health outcomes purely because of that intersection, right, of sex work and being transgender. And this is why rights are important, and this is why we have to demand that our sexuality, our sexual desires, and sex work to be seen as work, because there are protections that come with that, and all of us benefit from that anyway with all of our other work. So yeah, for me it's particularly sad because I have lost friends who particularly exactly embody that. And so yeah, trigger warning, man.
I'm sorry, trigger warning. I'm sorry, everyone. That trigger, I'm sorry.
But it's the truth. It's the reality. I mean, if it's that hard for us to hear, imagine living that. And I think
exactly
that's why we don't have an option to be quiet. When we are in spaces where we have the power to say something, we have to use that in service of such people as our friends. And people often think we do this work as sex worker, human rights defenders, just because we know the reality every single day, that this is real. It's not just hypothetical liberation of women.
Yeah, and I think even though it's difficult to speak about the violence, it's also important for us to speak to it for the very reasons that you're saying, Dr. T, for people to recognize that, when you're transphobic, when you're homophobic, it contributes to like creating a world that's more unsafe for women, for trans people, for queer people. Like this has real repercussions. This is not just rhetoric, I know like that part of the conversation with Kachenga for me was hard because we went from like sort of laughing about experiences to her saying, if somebody comes onto me near my hairdresser, and I have to think about, okay, what's going to happen when they realize I'm trans? Do I now have to avoid this particular hairdresser because now they know I'm trans? And it's like, wow, like to have to think about like that level of your life, whether you can still go to the same hairdresser because now somebody knows you're trans. Nobody should have to live like that. Nobody,
I want to speak about Fatu. Amma, you can go.
No, it's fine. So I actually wanted, Tlaleng said something that just stuck, right? I mean, Tlaleng in speaking about wearing a bikini and all of the hang-ups that people expect you to have. I thought of Maureen's story in the book, right? Maureen talks about how being a dark-skinned Black woman in France had affected her self-confidence and her self-esteem. And I think often there's the idea that you can self-love out of these oppressive systems, right? And And I was struck by that, and I want us to just speak a little bit about that, right? About how what it means for people who may not tick the boxes of desirability to still want pleasure and to still have to navigate those kinds of oppressive systems. Because often the advice is just love yourself. I mean, really? But what does that mean when you're a Maureen? What is it?
If you don't love yourself, how do you expect anyone to love
Nobody
yourself?
else will, right?
The world literally every day tells me that if I look like this, I'm unlovable. So there's no amount of love that I can love myself for the world to love me, because the oppressive beauty standards in the world are saying, yeah, not you.
And I wanted both of you to just speak around ideas of pleasure and what that means in oppressive systems that exist, particularly for women of color, right? For Black women, because there is no escaping those ideas around desirability, around ticking the boxes, right? Around being a dark-skinned Black woman in France. What does that look like?
Yeah, Maureen's story, like that was like also another hard one. And I remember that she was one of the people who responded to a call out I did on Twitter. And at the time, I think I'd been feeling a little bit down because I had interviewed too many people who had shared traumatic stories with me. And I was looking for like some stories to lift me up. And so I was like, are you living your best sex life? Do you want me to interview you for my book? And she responded and said, I'm not living my best sex life, but I still want you to interview me. And I'm really glad she reached out to me, because that's a really, really important story, how Black women grow up not feeling beautiful in majority white societies, or, as was also in the case of Maureen, they are exoticized, they are objectified, and, they are kind of seen as women who are good enough to fuck, but not good enough to date. And it's so funny because, lots of people watch Lupin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, on Netflix, which I also love. And they're like, where are the Black women in the show? And I'm like, read Maureen's story and you understand, Yeah.
The chocolate, what do they call it? Brown chocolate, for Black women who are dark-skinned in Europe. So they really make you into this like exotic thing. You just like, can you just see me as a human? Like, because a lot of those descriptions are very dehumanizing, and I think it excuses people's violence towards us, right? Or because of a big bum or big boobs, now you must do tricks with them. It's really just it's.
And they don't see you, as Kachenga says, like they don't see me, so they see you as a sex object, and that's where you end. Like they're not interested in you, and over that.
Or there's a gratitude that you should have, right? That despite me not ticking these boxes of desirability, you chose me. And so, of course, even that hampers your ideas of pleasure and how vocal you can be, because you should just be grateful that this person has chosen you in a sea of like so many better candidates. And we don't talk about that, right? That even in majority Black countries, that those are real things around colorism, around texturism, right? Around fat phobia and the idea that in order to be beautiful, you need to meet these Eurocentric standards of beauty, and what that means for your attainments of pleasure, but your own ideas of what you can vocalize, of what you can demand, of what you can say no to and decline.
And Alma, that's not just like a feeling, right? Like they will literally say it as much. You should be grateful. Right?
Sure.
And how I guess how dare you be so confident and you're so fat? Yes. Like how dare you? How dare you say you love your body? Exactly.
You're beautiful for a fat girl.
I wanted to speak about Fatu and Nura, and I'll just read who they are because I feel like Nura's story. I was like, okay, girl. So Nura is a 42-year-old Kenyan woman who describes herself as currently immersed in a very heteronormative space. She lives in Senegal with her husband and his other wives. And I just want to read the first paragraph of Nura. She says, "My sister wives and I have nothing in common." Well, that's not exactly true. We have His Excellency in common. We are all married to the same man. And then we've got Fatu. Fatu is a 60-year-old bisexual woman from Senegal. In this story, she shares about living as a polyamorous woman and how she's negotiated her sexuality while living in a conservative Muslim majority society. And then there's another story in the book about like the woman who came to Islam and in coming to Islam realized that she really wanted to have a family and have, her religion brought her closer to wanting to be in a coupling. So I want to speak about like religion and culture, and how religion and culture in conservative states allow Black women to negotiate their sexuality. Because we meet Nora, right, who basically is like, oh, I met this man, and I said to this man, like, I will not move unless you marry me. And then they got married virtually. And after getting married virtually, she then goes to Senegal, right? And when she gets to Senegal, she's like, my husband and I know that at a particular time we're going through this window is when we have to be alone and be intimate because no one will disturb us. And then you have Fatu, right? Fatu is basically like, I was married, he was married, and then
Let's go.
and it was lit and it was nice, and then I got up with this person because I've always wanted to be with a woman, got to be with a woman, and it's just like these women are like, oh, I love it because you're living in like a conservative state, and you're just like, you know what? I'm going to live my best life, and this is how I'm going to do that. And I wanted to speak about their stories, like about your experiences of their stories too.
Can I contrast that? You're talking a little before Nana says, can I just contrast that with Bibi, right? Because
Yes.
Bibi's story is particularly interesting because Bibi is the flip side of that. Bibi
Sure.
goes to this evangelical church and develops a fear of sex, right? And you think of like the vaginismus that some women experience because you have been brought up to believe that like sex is bad and sex is wrong. And so in some aspects, you see that religion is freeing, and that culture and religion allow people to come into themselves. But there's also a flip side where religion and culture also constricts women's imaginations around sexual pleasure. And I'm interested in that. So yes, I want us to talk about those amazing stories, but there is a tension that I think we can explore as well, which is interesting.
Yeah. No, that's true. So the juxtaposition of how religion can be liberating, but also very limiting. And more than not, it's limiting and not liberatory. So that's why like these stories stand out, because you're like, oh, okay, but we know
there's class things about why that stands out. There's class things about why those women can navigate it in the way that they do, right? And there's an intricate relationship, but because this woman leaves and she goes to Senegal, she sounds and she looks a particular way. That's why she has nothing in common with her sister wife.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. No, I mean, I love all of those stories for like so many different reasons. Like Fatu is just like almost like a role model for me, and I think what I really love about Fatu is even though she's in a Muslim majority society, and everything she does is like anti the society. I don't know if you remember, like her sister's always like, oh my God, are you going to wear that? Are those the shoes you're going to wear? She is just like, forget society, I'm going to do my own thing. And it's like she carves a space for herself, and she lives her own life, really just sort of putting the society to the side, right? And then for someone like Noura, in her own words, like spirituality and sexuality are just two sides of the same coin and they go together, and part of the reason why she wanted to be married is so she can have sex. And so she's going to have sex, and her, I almost want to say, yes, I almost want to say poor husband is thinking, oh, I'm marrying a woman in her 40s, her libido won't be as high. And he's like, woo, can I keep up? And then, like you said, Bibi on the flip side, I mean, she actually, and a number of women in the book had to step away from church. Estelle is also another example, before they felt like they could be free to like figure out their sex lives for themselves, because for them, religion was a repressive force where what they were being like forced to reckon with was a huge sense of shame, around sexual beings and being told more or less sex is bad or sex can only be done in particular ways, within particular constraints, whether that be marriage. And and at the same time, you have someone like Shanita, who is a woman who went on the started off 100 days of celibacy and went into 1,000 days. And that for her was part of like a spiritual journey into herself, to figure out, who she really is and what brings her pleasure. And was also an opportunity to like just discover her body and what brings her pleasure. So I don't think it's one thing or the other. I think it's also really about how people interpret faith and how they choose to interpret faith. And and whether they choose to stick rigidly to doctrine, especially doctrine that's being preached by other people, or whether they try and sort of figure it out for themselves. I don't think I'm explaining this very eloquently.
No, I think you're doing very well.
I mean, look, and as a Catholic, I'll say that probably the most non-Catholic thing ever.
Catholic.
And what has been really affirming for me, right, is that one of my cousins is a Catholic priest, but also the other priest as well are very supportive of my work, and they actually have the book, and they're now included in marriage counseling as something that they go to because obviously they recognize their own limitations. And so that's another way, I think, where religion, when it wants to, it can be something that's positive and affirming of people. Of course, Catholicism has a long way to go, and we have many other things to sort out as well. But I do think there are these little pockets that are, at least showing us that, there is a possibility even within church, and that sexual pleasure is not in contradiction, right, with your spirituality or anything like that. And so often with my patients, we have these discussions about sex being dirty, making you dirty, and reducing your worth as a woman. But the truth is, if your penis is reducing my worth, the problem is not me. You need to look elsewhere, right? Because you have bigger problems if your penis devalues me. But anyway, I think that's just one way of sharing a positive deflowering.
Oh, you've been deflowered. Oh my gosh, you've been deflowered.
Defiled. I mean, deflowered is even interesting, right? So it's like the idea that you have now been dirtied, and you think of ideas around cleanliness and dirtiness, and how so much of that is also coded in our language around sex and pleasure. Nana,
if you're a virgin, they ask you, are you pure? It's not like, it's like purity is purity. Are you pure? Have you lost your purity? What? What do you mean have I lost my purity?
I mean, even this thing like loss of virginity, no one is losing anything. Gaining it. You are gaining yourself. You are gaining all of these wonderful things.
In the same way you talk about giving it up, what are you giving up? Like giving it up. I am giving it up. What has been given up? And I mean, language in itself is just, I think there's another book just in the language around sex. But I'm curious for both of you, now that you have written your book, Nana, I mean, there's a chapter on healing, and I want to know what your imaginations around healing are now that you've written this book and you've read these stories and you've been able in many ways to participate in some of these stories. So what does healing look like to you?
Oh wow, that's a huge question, because to be honest, I don't think I personally have taken the space and time, for healing that I should have, because I think that's what it requires. It requires stepping back from daily life, and really figuring out space and time to go inward. And I think it sometimes requires professional help. It often requires community to support you. And that's actually something that I plan to do and also to write about. Yes. So I'm just going to end on that teaser.
Nana, I'm already ready. Please take all my money. I'm saying take all my money.
Sign our books.
Exactly.
Sign our books.
We need to go to Ghana just for a book signing.
I would love to come to South Africa too. If it wasn't for
that.
We're ready. I know.
Even my house is open. Just come.
Oh, thank you.
Just come at the airport and we're there.
Thank you. I'll be there soon.
And you can travel with your toys.
Unlike Ebony, right?
Dr. T, but about you, right? Like, your book has been out for almost 2 years now. What are some of your reflections, right? Are you surprised by the responses that you've received, right? I know that like a number of people, let's say for instance on Twitter, are like, oh my gosh, I'm even more confident to go to the doctor now. Because now I actually know when I go to the doctor, I'm like, Wabana on page 15, ne? This is actually the condition that I have. So can we talk about this condition?
Yeah. And what's been surprising is specialist gynecologists who've said to me, I've helped them be better doctors because they never spoke about pleasure with their patients, which is such a, it's like, how do you not, right? But that has really been surprising. And also it's that fathers are buying the book for their boys, which is, yeah, we'll take that. We like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And but it's the moms who are saying, oh no, my daughter is too young. And I'm like, how old are they? And she's like 20. And I'm like, but you know,
Your daughter
so
has
those
been
have-
doing things, but yeah, we're not going to talk about that. Nana, as you can tell, we've absolutely enjoyed the sex lives of African women. We think that like every household should have. I'm particularly, as Alma said at the beginning of this conversation, SCX is my favorite. It's my favorite thing because I think that it's important for us as Black people, as Black women, as Black femme people, to say this is how we have sex and we love to have sex. And like for the longest time, cis heterosexual people have been the ones who've been talking about sex so openly. It's time for us to say, you know, sometimes I sit on Faces and I enjoy it, or sometimes sometimes I start to, and I just want to have sex with this man and then this woman and this man and this woman.
Come on
and
now.
that's what I love, right? I'm particularly struck by why women who write like, this man wants me to limit my freedom, you know, like, and I don't want to limit my freedom. And I think like this really is the beginning of thinking about like, sex is not this taboo thing, but really is an integral part of our lives. So thank you really so much for the work you've done in the last 10 years, but also thank you particularly for writing the Sex Lives of African Women, because I think that like more and more women are going to read this story and find themselves here, or more and more women are going to read this story and it will be a catalyst for them to begin their journey of either self-discovery, freedom, of healing. So from the Cheeky Natives, Nana, thank you so much for writing this book.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It's been so great to be here and so great to be in conversation with you, Dr. T. And thank you, Cheeky Natives, for this amazing platform. So happy to be here.
Cheeky Natives, yeah.
No, I think Nana gave us a teaser, and I think she just needs to expand a little bit on the teaser. It would be remiss for us to let Nana go without Nana expanding a little bit on the teaser that she gave us.
And I love exclusives, right? Like, you know, like I feel like we create this like environment where people are like, oops, I shouldn't have said that. But please,
but
Nana.
It's exclusive.
I mean, I guess all I want to say is I'm super interested in exploring even more the themes of my book in my own life and writing about it, because that's one of the things I do. I write about my personal experiences. So expect more.
Nana, I would refer to memoir. You know, we love memoirs. We love people's lives. So, Nana, we're already saying we are booking your spot on programming for when your book comes out. The next one, we are booking a spot to us to go deeper.
In the meantime, everybody needs to get a copy of this book, not only for themselves, but for everybody in your life. This is a must read. Along with this, of course. And really, we just want to say thank you to both of you for what has been such an amazing and just engaging and beautiful conversation. Thank you to both of you for your openness and for your tenderness in making sure that these stories get told, but also that people come into the full realization of the right that is sexual pleasure. So thank you from both of us.
And if you want to say something, a copy of your book, of this book, actually of both books, right? You can just email us at info@cheekynatives.co.za. I think our store is going to be back up soon. We had some technical difficulties, but we're back. We can't hold sex down. So please email us at cheekynatives.co.za and we will get you a copy of these wonderful books. Thank you both to you, Dr. T, and to Nana. And thank you for everyone who joined us for this fantastic conversation. Mwah. And also, if you're going to participate, please dedicate to us tonight. Just dedication. Just one of the rounds to us. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.